So in this week's video, I want to go back to a road trip I took in 2013, August of 2013 to be specific. One of my philosophies of life is that you have to try and make the best of whatever you are dealt. And sometimes that's easier than others. And this is kind of a story of how one time where something went really, really wrong ended up being really, really right. And so it's kind of one of those tales of you never know how something's going to turn out in the moment, so you should just go with it. So in August of 2013, I was planning a trip to Seattle to attend a geocaching event at geocaching headquarters. At the time, I was driving a 2008 Jeep Patriot. Now, when I first bought it, I thought the Jeep Patriot was going to be the perfect vehicle for me. It had a little four-cylinder engine, so it was economic. It had a little bit of extra ground clearance. It had four-wheel drive sort of capability. So it was perfect for a back road exploration vehicle. I mean, it was never going to be a rock crawler, but I don't do that type of driving anyway, so I don't need that. But I want something that's more than just, a parking lot pavement queen. So I had this Jeep Patriot, and almost from the get-go, it developed electrical problems. There was always something going wrong with it. And I had multiple mechanics here in town look at it. They tried different things, and it would work for a while, and then it would start to fail again. And it would usually fail through, the engine would start to sputter and die and things like that. So regardless of these problems, I decided to take this on my trip to Seattle. Maybe not the brightest move, but what are you going to do? Tucker and I hopped in the Jeep and we set off to Seattle. And I don't think I even made it to Banff before I had my first issue with the car driving down the highway. Suddenly it started sputtering, it lost power, and I had to just pull over to the side of the road. Typically in that situation, I would just power it off, wait a few minutes, turn it back on. Sounds like an IT career. So I would basically reboot the car and it would drive again and it would be fine. Everything was fine, crossed over the Continental Divide, as you can see in the photo here. Start heading down the hill into Radium, BC, and the car starts sputtering, blip, 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 doing that thing again. So I shut the engine off, pulled over to the side, shut the engine off, turn it back on, and it's doing the same thing. So I ended up basically limping down into Radium, BC at about 15 kilometers per hour with my four-way flashers on, pulled over onto the side of the road as much as I could, even though it's a fairly narrow road coming through that canyon into Radium. And I get as far as the Esso station, right at kind of the main corner there in Radium, and I pull in. They diagnosed the problem. They found it was a bad throttle body, and so they needed to get parts. This is a small mechanic shop. You're in the middle of, what's not necessarily a large town. There isn't a lot available. So the mechanics agreed that they were going to have this throttle body shipped in, and basically I ended up getting stranded for a couple days. I ended up staying at the Bighorn Motel in Radium. Tucker and I found a room there and checked in. It was close to the service station, which worked out perfect. And, we walked around Radium a little bit, got to check out this really cool abandoned motel. I wonder if it's still there. I should check on Street View or whatnot, but basically killed a lot of time in Radium until such time that the car was ready. The throttle body came in on a Greyhound. They got it installed. It was late Saturday when they finally got it up and running. And so I was suddenly free to go. And so I decided, well, I can't make it all the way to Seattle now, but let's at least head as far as Creston. So I took off down the highway, went out to Creston BC, stayed in, pitched a tent in Yak Provincial Park, and then did a little exploration on Sunday. And this is where the story really takes a nice turn. There was always a place just north of Creston called Wendell. And when I was a young kid, like 8, 10 years old, my aunt and uncle and my grandmother would always go out with me on a long weekend out to Creston, and we would pick apples and things. Well, they would pick. It was basically a trip to gather apples and things like that. And there was one place we always would go back to. I believe his name was Bill Mather, and he lived in Wendell BC. So just for fun, while I had all this time to kill, I decided to see if I could make a trip out to Wendell and see if I could spot Bill Mather's old house. I mean, he was a fairly old guy back then, which was in the early 80s, so I figured he's probably long gone, but maybe some of his family's watching. And anyway, as I go out to Wendell, I discover this grain elevator, which I had never seen before. I hadn't really thought about it, or I don't think I really knew about it. And it was just like, wow. And it was this old United Grain Growers elevator, picturesque setting with the trees and the hills. And it was just phenomenal. And I had a great time wandering around, taking pictures of this grain elevator. The only camera I had with me at the time was an iPhone 5, so all the pictures aren't the greatest. I really wish I would have had a better camera, but the iPhone 5 was pretty advanced at that time. And it was just fantastic. Walked along the railroad tracks, took some photos. This one here is probably still one of my favorite photos of all time. And it was just a great experience. Wendell also has this abandoned service station, which was really cool to check out and see. And like I said, it was a great experience. I loved seeing the grain elevator there. So the next day, I started working my way back home. And right alongside the highway, I saw what looked like kind of an abandoned touristy cabin or tourist cabin kind of place. So I pulled over and checked that out, and that was also a really great find. I mean, I've since seen other people comment on it, but at this time, I knew nothing about this. And it was like, wow, what a great find. These little cabins sitting out here right alongside the road being overgrown. This was just, it was a great trip for finding all this abandonment. But what really makes this a story about making the best of what you're dealt is just a few months after I visited the grain elevator at Wendell, it was demolished. And had my Jeep Patriot not broken down and stranded me in Radium and forced me to spend the weekend in BC instead of Seattle like I had intended, I never would have made the detour out to Wendell, and I would have missed the chance to see this classic grain elevator in person. So, you know, at the time I was not happy about missing out on my event in Seattle, and I was frustrated with the expense of the car repair and the expense of the extra hotel and all of that stuff. It was supposed to be a pure camping trip, so I wasn't budgeted for that kind of expense, but it was a great trip and probably one of the best solo trips I've ever taken. And I got to see some amazing things, and it was all thanks to a bad throttle body. So let that be a lesson. You never know when something that sucks in the moment is going to pay big dividends down the road. Thank you for watching. Really appreciate your support, and we'll see you